This week's episode of What the Hell is Matt Playing This Week is brought to you by the official Orange Chatter Discord. There's a link down in the description. Come join the discussion. Tell me how wrong I am. Come play some video games. We do all that stuff. Please see you there. You know, improvising these is really not great. So, this series is 2 weeks old now. This is the second episode I've ever done of What is Matt Playing This Week. And I am about to lie and talk about something I am very specifically not playing this week. Something I very specifically haven't really played in months, to be quite honest with you, which is bizarre. I should probably actually play more of the games I'm talking about before running off on these tangents, but whatever. The game I'm talking about, specifically not playing this week, is the entire MMORPG genre, with one exception, World of Warcraft. But I'll explain that in a second. Effectively, this channel, which was founded long ago on the ideas of MMORPGs, is being run by somebody who doesn't even really touch the genre anymore. With the not terribly noteworthy exception of World of Warcraft specifically for its raids, and only because I have a really awesome and strong community around the game. If I weren't playing with my good friends, I wouldn't be touching that game. Have you seen Battle for Azeroth? It's basically on fire all the time. Burning of Teldrassil, more like burning of this entire franchise to the ground. Now, I would like to use this video, this week's edition of What is Matt Playing This Week, to talk about why that is. Because I've talked in various different contexts about why, and over time I've developed a theory and a set of ideas as to why I really don't get the enjoyment out of most of the modern MMOs on the market these days that I used to. There were a lot of good games once, and a lot of games worth playing and spending time in. I have spent so much time, I've spent years, more than a year of play time in World of Warcraft and other similar games. I played MMOs for years, or my favorite genre almost exclusively to today. But none of them really feel good anymore, and I want to talk about my theory as to why. And it comes in 3 delicious, delectable chunks. So we're going to go through those one by one. Starting with number 1. I want you to close your eyes and enter into a realm of dreaming. And in that dream, you will envision for me the ideal MMO. Sorry for the stupid wizard voice. That's the problem with me not actually writing a script for these. The jokes are all just out of my face, and usually they're bad. So I am going to break down what I would say is the ideal MMO for you. Because, well, that's just part of my theory. I need it as backing to explain the rest of it. And I believe that the ideal MMO has 3 parts. And yes, I know I'm nesting lists. Just let me get through this. So, number 1, we have long-term reward cycles. What are long-term reward cycles? Well, they're exactly what they say on the tin. That is a cycle in which the player is rewarded after a considerable amount of time and effort is put in. Now, why do I say that this is essential to MMOs? There are plenty of MMOs out right now that have rather short-term reward cycles, but I kind of consider that to be a serious problem. Long-term reward cycles generate a considerable amount of investment in a game, specifically when those long-term rewards are momentous and part of gameplay. So you want a ubiquitously useful thing. Traditionally, that has been gear. Items that you wear in your character increase your stats, allow you to progress through more and more of the game's content. Now, why are long-term rewards? Why do they have to be long? Long-term reward cycles often require grinding or time investment that a lot of people might not be comfortable with. It's counterintuitive to think that people would enjoy more grind, because for the most part, grind is a really dirty word. But long-term reward cycles imply a few things. A long-term reward cycle, first off, implies that the reward gained itself will have a long life cycle. That means the thing that you get out of that long-term reward cycle will last you a considerable amount of time. If you've played modern MMOs, you know that this kind of isn't present anymore. You're replacing gear with fairly high frequency in many of these games, even at endgame. which is not really a fun thing. You might get it quick, but it also goes quick. But there's also something called delayed gratification and a reward satisfaction for increased effort. And I'm going to actually cite some fucking evidence. We have a 2012 paper in the Journal of Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience at Oxford, which is called Effort Increases Sensitivity to Reward Loss Magnitude in the Human Brain. Who the fuck names these things? Not important. But this study concluded that the amount of time spent obtaining a reward of some sort increases the magnitude of reward feelings. So if you spend a good amount of time working towards something, you will feel better about that than if you spent a small amount of time working towards something for the same thing. Effectively, the effort does inform how much you feel for the reward. So why does this matter? Why should we focus on this? Because longer-term rewards feel better, drive greater degrees of investment. It makes sense that the longer you generally wait, the more you need to work for something. And working hard for something and waiting for something generally elicits a greater response. We want better, more intense feelings of reward. That's what drives engagement. That's not even to say things like goal setting and people who optimize their builds and then spend weeks and weeks working towards those optimal builds. The completion of that build in vanilla World of Warcraft, that could be equivalent to the old concept of full epic, felt really good to finally obtain. It was like a long journey is coming to an end and then a new journey is starting because, of course, you're moving on to the next tier. But this is counterbalanced by something, and something I want everybody to keep in mind. While long-term rewards are generally good, there is a concept called delay discounting. What delay discounting is a mental system which basically reduces the value of a reward based on how long or how much effort needs to go into it from the perspective of somebody starting to get that reward. So when you're sitting there looking at the item that you need to farm up, and you realize that it's going to take you 2 weeks to farm the materials for this item, your brain immediately lowers the value of that item in your mind at that point due to the amount of time you need to spend. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because this is extremely important for later. The second essential part of an ideal MMO are mechanics that strongly push community creation. I've talked about this before. Games that I wouldn't say force, because forced community is just as ineffective. But games that strongly encourage community engagement, or the player to take it upon themselves to engage in the community, generally have stronger communities than those that don't. The WildStar Remnant community couldn't use the game's matchmaking features because nobody queued for them, and instead built groups and set up events for themselves. And that community is extremely tightly knit and united. Even now, after the game has shut down, they are still a really strong community, and that says something. Engaging with your fellow community members is a great way to feel more involved in the community. So things like matchmaking services that remove that need to engage with the community are generally kind of detrimental to the process. The third one is also kind of obvious. Long content lifespans, which can be achieved in either an abundance of content, having a shitload of stuff to do, or making that stuff take a considerable amount of time and effort to complete, making the content harder or more hardcore, to use common parlance. Those three aspects, long-term reward cycles, mechanics that strongly push community cohesion, and long-term content lifespans, come together to form what I would call the ideal MMO. A game with a long time horizon to it, where players are engaged and invested during the entire period of it. It's an extremely effective and extremely good way to build communities. If you want a good example of some of these, early World of Warcraft, during the vanilla, Burning Crusade, and even into Wrath of the Lich King, essentially embodied these three ideas. MMOs before this, games like Final Fantasy XI, Dark Age of Camelot, Ultima Online, they all also followed all of these stringents. And many of those games still exist in one form or another to this day. can't really say that for some of the modern MMOs, which leads me to my next set of points. The modern MMORPG market. I'm going to break down how this part of my argument works using a little bit of economics. It's not going to be exactly, but the contents and the concepts are essentially the same. So let's get to work. Sorry, this video is getting super sciencey for those of you who aren't appreciative of my weirdness. So, Economics 101. Say you have a market, and the market demands a certain type of product. In this case, we're talking about an MMORPG. Now, back in 2005, MMORPGs were really hard to make and really expensive to host, so there weren't very many of them, or at least not very many major commercially successful ones. There were a couple that weren't commercially successful at all, but we're not going to talk about them because they died. Because of this, the few MMOs that there were generally really, really profitable. They also had a lot of freedom. Because they didn't have to worry too much about competition, because they did not have very many competitors, they were able to experiment and work in what you would think of as unintuitive features. Things like long-term content reward cycles, mechanics that strongly influence people towards communities, and long content lifespans. But a large amount of profit within a system always attracts new system entrants, and as the price of developing MMOs has come down over the last 10 years, which really accelerated in the last 5 years, a lot of new entrants have entered the market. You can see this by the number of games that come out every year. We get a handful of MMOs every year, when back in the day we might get one, maybe two, if it was an exceptionally busy year for MMOs. I'm talking early 2000s to mid 2000s. Nowadays, we're getting 3 or 4 a year. We've got a whole bunch on the horizon. There's MMOs coming out all over the place. Not only that, but the market is absolutely full of them. In this, we are approaching something called perfect competition. Under a structure of perfect competition, the amount of demand and the amount of products available, effectively the buyers and the sellers, reach a point where neither can effectively control the price of a product. Why does this matter? The price of a product doesn't really matter towards my argument, but what does matter is the degree to which these people need to compete with one another. The more intensely packed the MMO market becomes, the more MMO developers need to compete with other MMO developers, because there's a greater degree of choice. There are far more alternatives. So this competition leads to different design decisions. You need to find a way to get players to stay with your game, but you also need to find a way to draw players in from other games, because you're going to be losing players to other games almost inevitably, because they're doing the exact same thing. One effective way to do this is to make players feel like they're being rewarded more often. The central loop of most MMORPGs is an effort-reward loop. You are doing something and receiving a reward for doing so. That is core to almost every MMORPG that has ever existed. They're all about power progression. They're all about leveling up your character, gearing them up, and taking on bigger and badder things. That is at the heart of the entire genre. What's one way you could make this more enticing? You could draw people in? Well, one of the big flaws with a lot of the old guys are long-term content cycles. And why do I call that a flaw? Because of what we talked about earlier. Delay discounting. One way you can draw people in is to reduce the feeling of delay discounting. That means you're making it easier and making the process of acquiring items shorter. This allows you to feel more like you're being rewarded more often. Those rewards are eventually going to start being hollow, because intrinsically, the more often you're being rewarded, the less utility you're getting out of each individual reward, which reduces the reward's lifespan dramatically. There's no real great feeling for getting full epic when it only took you a week to do because you're getting showered with epics. Now, you could say that some of these games should be able to still get away with long-term content horizons. They should still be able to deal with these more competitive games that are leeching players away, and to that I say, not really. The nature of competition is that if somebody is doing something better than you, you're going to lose people. Every game is going to have a devoted niche fan base. That's just natural. There will be people who will always play Final Fantasy XIV and will never leave it for one reason or another, because games have intrinsic value. But that intrinsic value doesn't expand to everyone. Not everyone is going to play Final Fantasy XIV if a better game comes out. Or more accurately, a game that just feels better to play more immediately. They might return to Final Fantasy XIV later, but in order for Final Fantasy XIV to continue gaining people, they also need to start adopting some of these. Same with games like World of Warcraft. These big boys have had to shorten their content horizons to compete with the smaller, more versatile MMOs that are more interested in just grabbing people. And by just grabbing people, they're drawing away from the main source of these games and fundamentally slowly changing the very tone of the genre. As the competition increases, the ideal trinity of MMO mechanics becomes less important because, if somebody realizes that they're going to have to grind before they can get to the fun stuff, no matter how great that fun stuff feels, that delay discounting is going to discourage them, and they're going to go to the game in which they don't have to grind to get to the good stuff. Because, well, it's just faster and more fun, despite the fact that overall, they'd likely have a better time spending the time, investing the time in the game that takes longer. They're still going to go to the shorter one because delay discounting kicks in. It's a mental structure that prevents us from seeing the true intrinsic value of certain things in the future. But let's move on to the third and final part of my argument. And before I go into this, I'm going to sum up the other two parts. First of all, we have ideal MMORPG mechanics that require long-term investment in a game. This is towards a community, this is through rewards and content distribution. Second, due to the MMO market's increasing competition, we're seeing these ideal mechanics be eroded through competition. A massive amount of competitive pressure is shortening content horizons and reducing community interactions through things like matchmaking services. As we approach perfect competition, this focus change becomes more and more dramatic. This is why I feel like a lot of MMOs these days ring really hollow, especially a lot of the free-to-play games that are out there. They have interesting and fun mechanics, but on the whole, they don't give you the same feeling of investment that you used to get out of older games. Of course, there's a level of nostalgia tied to every MMO you used to play, and the very feeling of entering an MMO itself. MMOs aren't like most games. They're these towering constructs in which you invest your whole self into, or at one point you would invest your whole self into. Nowadays, they aren't. A lot of the free-to-play games coming out these days, and a lot of the MMOs choking the market, are not these really grandiose experiences, but games that rely on a very stripped-down and basic version of a Skinner box model. That's what a lot of these games have had to resort to in order to compete, and even the big boys are falling victim to it. Games like World of Warcraft have vastly reduced their content horizons over the many years, and this puts additional strain on development as they need to keep up in order to make these games satisfying while still having short content lifespans and short reward cycles. It's also caused the erosion of communities through matchmaking services. It's unfortunate that all of this has to happen through competition, but it was also inevitable because MMOs are extremely profitable. That massive chunk of change that World of Warcraft made for many, many years was incredibly enticing, which is why in the mid-2000s we saw this explosion of MMORPGs like Warhammer Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, The Elder Scrolls Online, all of these other games. There was, of course, The Great Filter, which killed a whole bunch of them. Out of those three, the only one that I could really say is still successful or alive is ESO, and that, I didn't expect that one to be the winner, to be quite honest with you. But this is what lies at the core of my argument. This is why I don't really play these games anymore, because there aren't any great games out there. But despite this lack of really good MMOs, there is a huge market. There is a huge demand for these games. Otherwise, they wouldn't get imported. They wouldn't get developed constantly. There are people who really want a good MMO, something that is truly a good MMO. I point to Bless Online as proof to this claim. In the weeks and months leading up to the launch of Bless Online, there was a massive bubble of hype around the game, especially in a lot of MMORPG communities. If you wandered over there, you saw dozens of people hyping up, excited for this game. And when it came out, it turns out it was just kind of a half-assed, shitty import. Not worth anybody's time. This caused a massive hype implosion in which people rapidly turned on the game. But it makes perfect sense that this happened. All the warning signs were there in advance. It was yet another import game. I can't remember what country it came from. It was either Korea or Russia. But it was just another import game from there. We've seen these before, and they almost always go the same way. They're this huge hype bubble that then immediately deflates as soon as the game comes out. And it's getting worse with every single one. Games like Ashes of Creation and Pantheon Online and some others have got massive hype trains behind them. And this is because there's a huge market of people who want a good old MMO. A game that recaptures those ideal mechanics. A game that really comes back to what makes an MMO great. That wants you to invest your time, that rewards your time and respects your time. That fosters communities, that builds up content, that just feels good to play. But I don't honestly believe that kind of game can exist right now. So let me put it down for you in a depressing way that I'm going to have to. Any game like Pantheon, I believe Pantheon is an incredible plan. That game looks great. I don't know if it's going to make it. Other games, such as Ashes of Creation, might. But any of these games that are throwing back, World of Warcraft Classic as well, I think it'll be perched on the back of the main game, which will be fine. It'll keep it alive. But these old MMOs, they have to compete for market share. They have to compete with all of these games that are much more interested in just drawing the player in and giving them quick and easy rewards. And for a lot of the people who know deep down what makes an MMO great, that these long content horizons are worth it, for them, these old games are going to work. They will work wonders. They will be wonderful. You will immerse yourself and have a great time. But for everybody else who's looking for a game, who's looking for an MMO to play, it won't work for them. It might not work for them at all. They might be more interested in jumping towards the game that has matchmaking and short content horizons and short reward horizons. Games that make them feel rewarded but leave them feeling hollow, as opposed to games that promise them hard work and a grind and some long-term investment in return for a real sense of engagement. The problem is, I don't think any MMO right now can survive on its informed populace alone. I don't think any MMO can make it on just that group of people who knows they want something slow, something that takes its time. It needs the other people too, the people who are constantly being coaxed away by these short reward horizons and empty experiences. And that's why I think that most of these games are going to have to fail, or they're going to have to make deep compromises in what is at the core of their being. Which is why I can only think of one real solution, one real way to make this work, one real way out for MMOs, in which great MMOs like Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, and other throwback concepts, games that decide to take their time and allow players to become invested in their world, there's only one way I feel like these games can succeed. The MMO market needs to die. Thank you for watching this episode of What Is Matt Playing This Week. I know I kind of ended on a dour note there, but these are my honest feelings. This is my honest opinion of the MMO market. If you're interested in joining the discussion, and we discuss a lot, hop down in the comments, leave me something to think about, and I'll try my best to respond and get involved. If you want to poke me more directly, we've got a Discord. The link is in the description. Feel free to join up. We play games and talk about games all the time. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Matt, the Orange Hatter, and you all go out there and have a great one.